research methods in applied linguistics, computer-assisted language learning, sociolinguistics, grammar, introduction to linguistics, and we could go on. She also leads a group of undergraduate and graduate student researchers in her laboratory for applied corpus linguistics research at Montclair. So Dr. Goulart is what I call a true applied linguist. She is informed by her extensive experiences as a language teacher for both Portuguese and English in Brazil, in the United Kingdom, and in the US. Dr. Goulart's research considers situational and linguistic variation in L1 and L2 student writing, academic discourse, and register variation, often using corpus linguistics methodologies. And this work is increasingly considering the role of generative AI in student writing. Her work has appeared in journals such as Journal of English for Academic Purposes, Register Studies, my personal favorite, the Annual Review of Linguistics, and Reading in a Foreign Language, among others. But perhaps most exciting is that she has a brand new book that has just come out with John Benjamin's called Variation in University Student Writing. I happily removed the plastic wrap from my copy yesterday. That's how cutting edge this is. Dr. Goulart is also a co-editor on the forthcoming second edition of the Cambridge Handbook of English Corpus Linguistics with Doug Biber and Randy Reppin. And we have been very happy to welcome her as an associate editor for the journal Register Studies, where she has brought us renewed energy, the next level of organization, and a much needed increase in social media presence. On a more personal note, I'll point out something about Dr. Goulart, which will likely become evident as you listen to her talk today. Larissa has an innate ability to bring enthusiasm, excitement, and genuine joy to everything she touches. You simply can't talk to Larissa without feeling happier and more optimistic than you were when you started the conversation. She continues to be an inspiration to me, both professionally and personally. I mean, it is thanks to Larissa that I've now joined 2 new online book clubs. And she has an important Iowa connection in that her favorite cat was born in Iowa. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Larissa Goulart to Iowa State and TSLL 2024.
Thanks, Bethany. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm so excited. As Bethany said, my favorite cat was born here. So I'm really excited to be here, to be part of this conference too. So thanks Bethany, Carol, for inviting and for organizing me coming here. So my talk, as you can see, I'll talk about generative AI versus student writing, taking a register approach. As Bethany just said, I am the associate editor of Register Studies right now, and Register is what I've been doing for most of my research. But I wanted to explain where I'm coming from, because I know generative AI or AI has been out and about for a long time. I know that, for example, Calico had an AI strand before. I wasn't there. If you were there pre-2022, we were not together. I wasn't there with AI at that point, and I'll explain where I'm coming from. So my motivation for this talk and this research I've been doing recently is that I've always been interested in describing the lexical-grammatical patterns of student writing. This could be in composition classes, in undergraduate classes, disciplinary variation. Give me a variable, and I want to understand how students use grammar differently across this variable, across different assignment types. Mainly because, as Bethany said in my introduction, I've been an English teacher for a long time. So I'm always interested in how can we use, how can we describe the grammar and understand variation and apply that to the classroom. But then, probably as a lot of you here, in 2022, there was the public release of ChatGPT by OpenAI. And I started to get this question. I remember specifically TSLW2022. I think Dream Ranali was there too, presenting on this. And we started to get this question that was, why are you doing research in university writing if now students will only use AI to complete their assignments? And this was not just a question that I was getting from other researchers, but also from the administration at my university, who will eventually decide if I get tenure or not. So I was very worried about this. And we can say that perhaps I looked for the news to see what the news have to say. Maybe the news will calm me down. But what I got was actually lots of different newspaper articles saying ChatGPT will write essays like a student. They will write just like your research articles. If you're doing research in writing, you're done. It's over. I mean, Probably you think the same. So like, okay, the news is not the place where I'm gonna find answers. Maybe research, right? Researchers are gonna say it's okay, don't worry. But publications even from last year, like really early last year, were saying ChatGPT has demonstrated the ability to generate scientific papers that are similar to authentic papers that researchers would produce, or that ChatGPT can undistinguishably generate an essay like a human. I don't know how you're feeling, but I was feeling like this. Okay, so I was like, I cannot stay like this. So I propose that we examine these claims, like can generative AI really replicate student assignments? And I put this picture here to recognize the Brazilians. So if they laugh, they're Brazilians, because this is a common cartoon in Brazil. And this is a game that you probably played as a kid, like you identify the 7 errors right between the 2 images. We're going to do that. This requires audience participation with 2 excerpts. One is going to be student writing. One is going to be generative AI. This is part of a bigger text. I want you to keep that in mind, but I can only show you like 2 paragraphs, like 2 sentences, basically. Okay, give me 1 second to read this. Who thinks B or A was written by a student? Who thinks B was written by a student? Oh, only one person, I'm not gonna out them here. And, oh, I moved the Zoom, so that's why it's not. And you're right. B, so this is an argumentative essay. B was written by ChatGPT. A was written by a student. Okay, we're going to do this again, just one more, okay? So this is a creative writing assignment. Students were asked to write a Rick and Morty episode. If you don't know, Rick and Morty is this cartoon. Again, take 1 second reading and tell me which one is the student writing. Ready, Chris? Yeah. Okay, so A, student. B, student. Not. But you can see you're less confident, right? You are right, and you probably notice things like punctuation is a bit different than what the student is writing, perhaps like some verb subject agreement here. But you can see that you are more hesitant when we're talking about the creative writing assignment. So going back to me being desperate, can generative AI simulate student writing? Actually, sometimes depends on the assignment, but it's better at simulating this creative writing assignment, like you're not as confident, than the argumentative essay. There are things in the argumentative essay that makes it clear. So clearly, yay, there's register variation here, which is what I've been doing before. Okay, so this is what I will talk about, just so that we're all on the same page. I know that register has different definitions. Perhaps if you are at Iowa State, you have already heard about register many times from Bethany. But for those of you listening on Zoom or listening to this lecture in the future, I just want us all to understand what I'm referring to here as register. So registers are defined as culturally recognized category of text that can typically be recognized by a set of overt external markers. So for example, I think most of us here are teachers. If you see a syllabus, you recognize that as a culturally recognized register because it will have the title of the course, it will have the name of the professor, probably the time the class meets. So this is my understanding of register. If you don't agree with me, that's okay. Let's just get on board for this presentation. And usually through a register perspective, we call this the register triangle, how we do the analysis. We look at the situational context. This means describing, for example, the communicative purpose, the audience, the mode, the setting, lots of different things from the text. And then we do a linguistic analysis where we look at the pervasive linguistic features of a text. We can do this for different methods. And we put this all together in a functional analysis where we try to explain the use of the linguistic features through our situational analysis. Okay, now we're all on the same boat. Here I'm going to present 3 studies, but it's actually 3 steps, perhaps, of the same study. First, I'll talk about a very detailed situational analysis comparing student writing versus AI generated assignments, and I'll talk more about the corpus soon. Then the second one is going to be an additive MDA of student writing, and the third one would be a teacher identification task, and I'll tell you why I did that. So of course I didn't do things alone. There's a lot here. So this is the team that has been collaborating with me in these multiple projects, looking at AI versus student writing. So the corpus, as you see, the corpus that I'm presenting here, it's very small, and I'll explain why. I wanted a corpus that was very recent, like 2020, but pre-ChatGPT. We had a corpus like that, but not all the text had prompts. So we selected only the text that had prompts out of that corpus we had. These are all students, undergraduate students majoring in linguistics across 3 different registers. So essays, like you saw before, personal narratives, this is like, tell me about an English teacher that changed your life, and critiques. Now, I gave some examples here of what the prompt could be. Like critiques could be, I'll talk about a movie, talk about a play, kind of like more of a literary exercise. But these are, each student responded to a different prompt. They wrote this in a naturalistic context for their class. It wasn't something that we asked them to write specifically. So each of these 23 texts comes from a different prompt. They're not about the same topic. And how did we do this? So some of the students had a prompt like this, like the media often been accused of perpetuating stereotypes and so on. Now, so at this point, we used ChatGPT 3.5. When we gave the same prompt to students, we also added some clarification, right? I think the last presentation talked about prompt engineering. We wanted, it's not just give the same thing to ChatGPT. We said, like, you are a competent university student in linguistics, write an assignment, and here in assignment, where does it doesn't go on the TV. Here, when it says assignment, we would replace by the register, right? Responding to the prompt, and then we gave the same prompt. So this is the only modification we did when doing when creating the corpus with the generative AI. Okay, so study 1, the situational analysis of student writing in AI generated assignments. So for this one, each text in the corpus was annotated for these 5 situational features. First one was audience. So was the text written for a classroom purpose? The type of essay that you don't have a clear stated audience? Or was it a simulated audience? Like, for example, some assignments were a cover letter, like pretend you're applying for a job and write a cover letter. So we would call this a simulated. Second thing was explicitness of purpose, basically yes or no. Is there explicit statement of purposes? Kind of like in this essay, I will blah, 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 blah. Why did we have that? Because in our experience using generative AI, we found that a lot of the text generative AI produced had this explicit statement of purposes. And we're trying to find out what was different and what was similar. Then we also coded for nature of data. Again, these are all coded for yes or no. So it could be primary sources, like the student conducted an observation, the student conducted an interview. This would be primary sources for this purpose here. Secondary sources would be writing based on something else, like a different article that they read. And personal experience is kind of the example of tell me about your favorite English teacher, where they would have to draw on their personal experience. We also annotated for a bunch of different text layout features like headings, yes or no, abstracts, reference lists, in-text citations. We also included figures and other visuals, and you might be wondering, why did you do that if you knew ChatGPT could not do that? But we also didn't know students would include the figures or not. So we wanted to know if that would be something salient. If all students include figures, then that's going to be a big difference. We also included lists and bullet points because, again, in our experience, we thought that ChatGPT would use more lists and bullet points. And then the last thing, perhaps the thing that took us longer to code was communicative purpose. So a couple of years ago, 2022, Doug Biber, Randy Rappin, I almost said Doug Rappin, which would be very funny. Doug Biber and Randy Rappin and I worked on this framework to describe the communicative purposes that occur in undergraduate student writing. We adopted the same framework in this study here. So this means that we annotated each text to see, does it have some elements of argumentative text? Is it comparative? Does it have some explanation? Does it describe a tangible object? So each text was coded from 0 to 3 for all of these purposes. This means, so 3 would be, this is a major purpose here. 2 would be, this is it's like used to a greater extent, but it's not the major thing going on. One would be it's a purpose that's present, and zero is like this is not present. So as you might imagine, we had a lot of zeros for different purposes here. Okay, very briefly, let's check some of the results. This is it. Goodbye, you know the results. Okay, so let's walk through what you're seeing here. So the rows are obviously the registers, right? So essays, critiques, personal narratives. Now the use of plus and minus here is just a summary. It indicates if it is, so a plus and a minus would mean 50%, and two pluses would mean closer 80% or above. Okay, so it's just to give a perspective what's common or it's not. And then here we have generative AI and student writing. Going to highlight register by register. So when we look at essays, what do we have here? We see that both generative AI and the students, when writing the same essays, write them for a classroom audience, so they don't invent like an exterior audience. We also see that neither, so opposite to what we thought would happen, they don't use explicit statement of purposes. Now, there are some differences when we get to secondary sources and citations and the bullet points. So we found that all the essays written by students included secondary sources and in-text citations. Now, when ChatGPT was asked to write the same assignment, it had half, perhaps, of those secondary sources and citations. Not only that, we checked, like for these citations, there were no hallucinations, but they were all older. They're all like from the 80s. And the students were using things like 2010 onwards. And then the use of bullet points, as expected, like students didn't use any bullet point or list, but ChatGPT had in half of their essays. So again, big difference. Now looking at the communicative purpose, I know this graph is a lot. Okay, so each line here is a different essay. Because we had exactly the same corpus, we could match one by one here. What you see in very dark green here, it's to explain. So this is the extent to which the annotators sought to explain in each text. And then this lighter green that looks kind of like avocado green, it's argumentative. And this light green is to propose. You probably look at this and think, okay, they're actually very similar, right? And you're right if you look at the purposes. But if we look at being creative, like the things that students do, you can see that ChatGPT has basically the same structure for all the essays. It is explain something that you're probably going to use for your argument, and then you propose a solution as a minor purpose here. Now with the students, we get like a different picture. We have only 4 essays out of the 23 that the student will use a proposal, for example. And then you see a lot of narrative here and some comparison and so on. So we see some differences here where the main purpose used by students and generative AI are similar. They argue and they explain, but students use different combinations of purposes. They're more creative, let's say, to a lesser extent. Okay, if we look at critiques, here we have a difference that is unexplained. So all of the critiques written by the generative AI, in this case ChatGPT, they were written for a classroom audience. The students wrote some critiques that were kind of in the format of a blog post. We don't know why, because this was not in the prompt. And they were all in different classes. So we don't know if it is maybe a discussion that they had with the instructor in the classroom and we weren't there to get this information. But half of the critiques were written kind of like, oh, I'm going to post this on my blog, like in an informal way. They didn't have explicit statement of purposes. They all had secondary sources, but students included reference lists and in-text citation. And even though ChatGPT included secondary sources like mention other studies, it didn't generate a reference list here, even though it did in essays. So when we ask write a critique, it's like, not a reference list today. For the communicative purposes, here we find that they are very similar. Actually, we see a different picture than what we saw in the essays, where students had more colors, right? Here, actually, ChatGPT is being more creative. Again, we find argument, explanation, a lot of narrative, but that's where students mainly stop. So this is what students will do in a critique. They will be explaining, like probably the movie or the book that they read. They'll add some aspects of argument, right, to say, this is very good or this is very bad, and they'll perhaps narrate the plot here. But the ChatGPT again includes a proposal. So apparently in every type of assignment we ask ChatGPT to write, there is some type of proposal to a solution to a problem. Not sure why. So both to argue and to explain appear in student and the generative AI critiques, but students narrate more in critiques, while the GenAI tends to include the proposal as part of the critiques. The last register that we looked at was personal narratives. And as you can see, they are very similar between generative AI and the students. Like both of them, half of them use classroom audience and outside audience. Also half look at explicit statement of purposes, and all of them include personal experience. So even when you ask ChatGPT to write something, write me about the English teacher that changed your life, ChatGPT will write about the English teacher that changed their lives, even if they don't have an English teacher. And we'll come back to this when we look at what the teachers said about these assignments. If we look at the communicative purpose, I'm just gonna use the same thing. It's very similar to when we look, compare the purpose across personal narratives. It's funny because even this personal narrative here, that was a bit weird. It's still weird when the student writes. So it is like fitting the prompt really. So they are, when we ask ChatGPT to write a more personal assignment, it's better at doing so. Okay, so just a summary, interim summary. Student assignments are characterized by use of secondary sources, in-text citations, reference lists, presence of a simulated audience, like readers of a blog in the case of critiques, more variation of communicative purpose in essays, and Gen AI are characterized by list and bullet points, older citations, and use of to propose as a minor purpose in all assignments. But Gen AI does a better job at simulating student writing when it is personal narrative. Okay, this is the situational features. Let's take a look at the linguistic analysis. So MDA of student writing in AI generated assignment. So you are probably all familiar at this point. There is lots of studies comparing the linguistic characteristics of AI and academic writing. If we look at other registers, there's even more. Here, I'm just trying to summarize the ones that are looking at published academic writing or student writing. They use different methods. They use machine learning. They will use like cometrics measures right now are very popular. Recently, Gion and Highland published one examining lexical bundles. I just want to highlight one. I know the font is very small. I'll get to a summary of this soon. I just want to highlight one thing here, is that all the studies that looked into student writing are looking at essays and not looking at how the students will do different registers compared to how the machine would do it. So what do these studies find? That academic and student writing is characterized by more features of stance, like hedges, modals, and epistemic markers. They also mention the use of specific punctuation, like dashes, parentheses, and semicolons. Now, they find that generative AI is more repetitive. And again, this will be a theme across these three studies. They find higher frequency of measures of syntactic complexity, measure ST units. I'm sorry, Bethany, it's what they did. They find more boosters, and they find more nominalizations. So here, because you saw that my corpus is only 53 texts, it wouldn't be possible to run a new multidimensional analysis. I'm going to run an additive MDA. But what is an additive MDA? It's when we add a new group of text or plot a new group of text into a previously existing MDA. It also allows for comparison against a range of other people who have done so before. Like in this study, Goulart and Wood from, I think this was published, 2021. We looked at all MDAs published from 84 to 2020. We found 210, and more than half of them were additive MDAs. So we could add, like, compare to all these 115 previous MDAs. Now, for those of you who might not be as familiar with MDAs, this is Biber 1988 MDA, and this is the first dimension. This is also what I'm going to be using here on this study. And what you see really here, oh, my thing doesn't work. I'm going to move here. What you see here really up, it's more involved discourse. So we have telephone conversation, face-to-face conversation. You can also think this as more informal. And what you have here on the bottom, it's more informational, very academic. So you have official documents, academic prose, press. Okay, well, I'll allow one guess. Where do you think ChatGPT will be? Where do you think the students will be? Halfway? Yeah. So Bethany is doing halfway, so we're gonna count that as halfway. So additive MDA results. Oh, you're gonna love this graph now. You can see everything, right? Super clear. So Viper's MDA has 5 dimensions. You can see here all the results. Just for you to know, I'm gonna present like critiques, essay, personal narratives. And whatever is in purple is ChatGPT. Whatever is in yellow, it's going to be the students. But I will focus only on dimension 1 and dimension 4, mainly on dimension 1, okay? But I already want you to notice one thing is that when we compare ChatGPT and students, there is, except for perhaps dimension 2, they're all very separate, very different, and more important, remember the previous studies were saying ChatGPT is repetitive? We see here in the dispersion, right, of my box plot, because students have huge dispersion. They're doing lots of different things. Now, when I'm looking at these grammatical features, like for example here, it's very small. It means that a lot of the grammatical features being used are the same. Okay, so involved versus informational production. Already explained this a little bit. So critiques, essays, personal narratives, purple ChatGPT, yellow student. Whatever is on the positive side, so right here on this box, means that it has more of the features of involved production. This will be first person pronouns, second person pronouns, contractions, be as a main verb, simple present, and things like that. Whatever is on the negative side, so in this box here, it's more informational production. So you see longer words, lots of prepositions, attributive adjectives, past participle, place adverbials. So this is what you see in these texts here, okay? So what do we see initially? We see that the AI generated assignments are more informational, or you can think of this as more academic than the assignments written by students across all 3 registers. In fact, if you look at the mean here for the students, for example, in personal narratives, you can see that the students in personal narratives load really high, like on the positive side, so 7.7, while the personal narrative written by ChatGPT, it's really low. So this means that even though it's a text where I'm asking you to write something personal, like write about your grandmother, ChatGPT is still being very formal, right? Being very academic. And we all I think we all agree that we would talk about our grandmothers like, oh, she's so lovely, she's so nice, like using not informal language. Another thing to notice that I mentioned before is that assignments written by students show this greater variation within register. And here, the way you can see this is that the box plot is like really high, really big. I have an excerpt for you to understand the difference that we're seeing here. So again, this is a critique. The students had read this play, Doubt, which also turned into a movie, so you might be familiar with. And they had to criticize, basically, or critique this assignment, this text. So you can see that the student here uses more simple present, right? Like revolve, suspects, also present perfect, like has it been, but also uses contraction like doesn't exist, doesn't have, also uses third person pronoun like her suspicion. If we turn to the AI, writing the same assignment, right? You see already how the language shifts, like John Patrick Shanley's Doubt, a parable delves into the intricate interplay of certainty and doubt power dynamics and the consequences of moral ambiguity within a Catholic school in the Bronx. Just wanted to highlight this because when we asked teachers to identify and why they were identifying, a lot of them mentioned specifically delves into, that it was very formal. They also mentioned there's another word like interplay. There's another excerpt that teachers saw that had plethora written. So they pick up on specific words. I'm giving spoilers of the rest of the presentation here. Remember I said that one fun thing we could do also is compare with previous MDAs that also use the additive MDA. I know the font might be a bit weird for you guys. Here on my computer, it's perfect. So people on Zoom are having the best here. So I just want to explain. So this is Viber 1988. This is the first one that I show you where you have telephone conversations, face-to-face conversations, and official documents. As Bethany and other people predicted, the ChatGPT assignments really load in the lower side, it's very interesting because it's even more informational than official documents. So official documents load at negative 18.1. And the ChatGPT critiques, for example, it's negative 27.2. Like I had never seen anything like that before. And here we're going to pick on Bethany. So this is grade 2015. She showed us the results for dimension 1. So she was looking at research articles in different disciplines. So you can see here that philosophy, research article in applied linguistics, political science, and so on. You can see that all of the research articles, so published academic writing, also loads closer to the negative side. So again, ChatGPT is really simulating what we see in academic writing. But I had another question, because you can see the students are here like negative 0.2, negative 3.4, and so on. And I also thought this was a bit weird because these students were too positive, let's say, they're too involved. So I compared them with my own MPA, looking at dimension 1. So I have this corpus of student writing in their disciplines, like arts and humanities, physical sciences, life sciences, and this is the results you see here. So as you can see, can you notice that like these students also are very different from these ones? So here in this study, I think we actually have perhaps two different problems. That ChatGPT is way more informational than published academic writing. This I think we all knew. But the students we have in our corpus are also way more involved than the traditional assignments we would see in engineering, in psychology. Perhaps it's the linguistics program they're in. They're way more involved here than we saw in other studies of student writing. Very quickly, I'll go over dimension 4, checking time. Overt expression of persuasion here. So again, just so that we're all on the same page, whatever is on the positive side means the use of overt expressions of persuasion. So this means suasive verbs, prediction modals like conditional subordinates, trying to convince somebody like possibility modals. Whatever's on the negative side means that it doesn't have these features. So we can see here that both like students and the AI text, they load on lack of expression of persuasion. And if you ever ask ChatGPT a question, I'm guessing we all have, you can see this because ChatGPT writes like a Wikipedia article rather than trying to convince you of something. And you can see that students do this a bit more, right? They have more trying to convince the author of something. So students are more persuasive than generative AI, even though they're mean, still it's on the negative side. And critiques have the greatest difference between AI and student writing. This goes back to what I was saying before. If you look at this box plot here, it's basically a line at this point. This means that a lot of the critiques use these features here, if I can go back, to the same extent, like in the same manner. Okay, so just again, summary of the additive MDA, intern summary again. What do we see? We see that for essays, dimension 1, it's really different. So when we look at informational versus involved discourse, I didn't talk about all these other dimensions, but the thing I want you to remember is that whenever ChatGPT is very one thing, so like very positive, it has a lot of features of explicit discourse, students will be halfway through it. So whenever ChatGPT is like very dramatic, students will be halfway through it for all the other dimensions. Then for critiques, we find the same pattern where ChatGPT is very informational and the student is very involved. This is what I showed to you in dimension 1. And we find the same thing, for example, ChatGPT lacks the use of narrative features totally. Students are halfway. They're in between. They use some features of narrative, but not as much. And when we get to personal narrative, again, we find the same difference in dimension 1. So dimension 1 is really big in distinguishing between these two. But when we get to the dimension that looks at the use of abstract features, so dimension 5, personal narratives and in student writing and the ChatGPT writing are pretty similar, actually. So things for you to remember. Dimension 1, involved versus informational production, has the greatest variation between assignments written by students and the generative AI. Generative AI is better at replicating the linguistic characteristics of like these personal narratives followed by critiques, and it's not so good with essays, which is a bit unexpected from like what we had hypothesized here in the beginning. Some possible explanations is that the personal narratives and critique, they state clearly in the prompt this expectation for personal involvement. So they clearly state, write about your experience with your favorite teacher. While an essay, the student will do that, but it's not clearly stated in the prompt. And I mean, the AI can only do what you tell it to do, right? And when asked to write an assignment, ChatGPT leans more academic. If you don't give specific instructions, it will be way too academic. Okay, so we were thinking, these are the linguistic features that we can analyze quantitatively, right? The difference between the two. But is that what teachers pick on when they're, now there's a lot of discussion about plagiarism. Are students using ChatGPT? How can we identify that? We wanted to know, what do teachers pick on? Like, is it linguistic features or perhaps like these other situational features? So what we did here, oh, actually, let me just tell you about this previous study. So there is, again, lots of previous studies looking at using like these identification tasks to determine if this is human generated or AI generated with different accuracy rates. I just want to highlight what they find. So humans, when you ask a human, give a ChatGPT text and a human text, usually what they pick on is the use of inaccurate references, repetition in formulaic language, vague language, and layout features. Okay, now back to the study. What did we ask teachers to do? Teachers were shown 8 different excerpts. Maybe some of you might have been forced into that study too. They had 4 generative AI prompts and 4 student prompts. So the prompts were the same, but teachers saw them in a random order. So they would see, for example, the Rick and Morty fanfic. They saw a longer version of that, the generative AI, and the student one. They had to grade like on a 5-point scale to see how confident they were. Is it definitely human, possibly human, neutral, and so on. And aside from defining, right, what it was, they also had to select some of the linguistic and non-linguistic features that help them in their identification task. We give them options, but we also ask them to comment. So a lot of them didn't use the options we gave and just wrote what they found. So the options were like complex versus simple vocabulary, longer and shorter sentences, grammar, punctuation, but then they had like this big comment box. And for non-linguistic things, we had formatting, topic, and other. Okay, so the first results we're going to see, these are all prompts that students wrote, okay, assignments that students wrote. So here it's a critique that a student wrote, an argumentative essay that a student wrote, a personal narrative that a student wrote, and a creative writing that a student wrote. And everything that's in blue here, it's the teachers identified as either definitely human or possibly human. So what do we see here? Can teachers identify when a student wrote an assignment? Primarily, yes, like more than 50%, I'm already happy. Some of them were still thinking like, oh, this is possibly AI. Just one person, and this is not the same person across all the survey, just one person thought it was definitely AI. So most teachers can accurately identify student writing, especially in critiques and argumentative essays. You can see that there's more teachers that are very confident too on their choice. When we get to creative writing, it seems that they are not as confident, right? We get a lot of possibly human and a lot of like misidentification here. Now, what do teachers say? What help them? So a lot of them point out errors, kind of like what we were talking before when I showed you some examples. Some of them say the author uses phrases that are slightly off, like got us all by surprise. I don't think AI would generate something like that. I see some minor grammatical mistakes, such as not using quotes or italics, for example. So this, it's not something that we had in our multidimensional analysis because we just annotated for grammatical features. We didn't annotate for errors, didn't include errors in our analysis. So it's not something that matches with our linguistic analysis, which is what we wanted to know. Another thing that they mentioned, and one of the presentations that just, I'm horrible with names. I think the previous presentation that just came here was talking about topics too. They mentioned that the generative AI cannot talk about like taboo topics. For example, there was one text I think about abortion. They mentioned that. There's this other one that's critiquing the movie Us. So it talks about understanding of racial stereotypes in the media. Yeah. The idea in here are human and show introspection. Okay, so these are the things that the teachers identify, help the teachers identify human writing. So basically, if you write about complex topics, you're a human. This now, are the excerpts written by the generative AI. Okay, so this, again, this is a critique, an argumentative essay, a personal narrative, and creative writing, but where ChatGPT wrote the assignments. Everything in yellow in this case is where the teachers identified it as human, definitely AI, or possibly AI. So for most, I would say not for most cases, for critique and argumentative essay, this is going great, right? Like they primarily identify AI as AI. There's just a couple of outliers. They're like 5, 1, 4, and 1. But it gets like perhaps a bit trickier when we're talking about the personal narrative and the creative writing. So if you look at the creative writing assignment, this is the Rick and Morty that you just saw. If we discount the neutrals here, it's half and half, right? They cannot really identify what is human and what is AI writing. So most teachers identify AI generated assignments if you look at the overall measure, but both the personal narratives and the creative writing are harder to identify. And what do the teachers find? What helped them identify AI? First, vocabulary. There are a lot of big words that are almost void of meaning. It looks like someone asked an AI to use hard vocabulary. Thesaurus words like merely, plethora, and manifold. So this really relates to what we saw in dimension 1 of the MDA, because in dimension 1, the negative side is the side that has like longer words, nominalizations. So, okay, this relates to our quantitative analysis before. And repetition. ChatGPT in particular loves to format sentences with particular phrases, especially each sentence has basically the same structure. A lot of them mention the use of ing. I struggle to write titles for my presentation, so you might have seen recently, if you look at my CV, everything has ing. It's because I write the abstract and ask ChatGPT to write the title, and I can see this happening here. So this also relates to the lack of dispersion in generative AI that was observed in the MDA. So we did see that like teachers are picking up stuff on things that we saw in the quantitative analysis. This is basically a summary of what the teachers find was helpful identifying student writing versus the generative AI. Now, there is one problematic issue. It is the case of first-person pronouns. Remember I said ChatGPT can write an essay or an assignment about their favorite teacher, about their grandmother. Some teachers were like, marked an assignment, the personal narratives, as generative AI, because they believe, like, for example, this use of me as AI doesn't have its personal experience. So they believe because ChatGPT is a large language model, it's a computer, it cannot write anything using first-person pronoun. It cannot draw on their personal experience. And these are just some examples of their answers. But we saw that actually personal narratives can be more involved than any of the other generative AI registers because we state in the prompt that I want the generative AI to be more involved. Oh, what happened? So summary of the identification tasks, like most teachers can identify assignments written by students and AI generated assignments. Most, we're looking here at percentages. But teachers are more confident when it comes to student assignments than the generative AI texts. More personal assignments like personal narrative and creative writing were more difficult to identify. And in their response, most teachers indicate that AI wouldn't use personal pronouns, which is not accurate. So it's something that we need to think about. Okay, so conclusions. Can GenAI simulate student writing? Yes. Again, sometimes. But it's better at simulating certain registers. The linguistic analysis showed that generative AI currently uses linguistic features associated with informational discourse, like nominalizations, longer words, premodify nouns, to a greater extent than students. And I want to highlight that I'm saying here currently because we did this with 3.5, and I'm pretty sure if we try for, the target is always moving. So if we try this 6 months from now, it's probably going to be better at this. It's more repetitive. Generative AI is more repetitive, lacks features of stances and hedges, and it's better at replicating these more involved assignments. So again, creative writing, personal narrative, because they clearly state this involvement in the prompt. What about the teachers? So teachers find that generative AI is more repetitive, so similar to the linguistic analysis. It does not discuss these taboo topics or controversial issues, but they also find that it cannot use first-person pronoun, which we know we all here are going to spread the word. This is not true. I think like there's been a lot of discussion about AI literacy for teachers. And when people talk about this need for AI literacy for teachers, they usually refer to Long and McGurk 2020 that talks about these 5 questions, like what is AI, what can AI do, how does AI work? There's a recent publication that came out, I think like 2 weeks ago by Peter Crossfight, who gave the plenary here last year, trying to think of like a framework for AI literacy. But I would like to propose something different. I think we need to work on like what is AI literacy for the teachers, like what is the basic that teachers need to know? Because as Goodwin Jones was presenting before, like teachers don't have the time for all this training. Perhaps we should focus on what can AI do, like include one lecture that says like, this is what AI can actually do so that they don't get mistaken with the first person pronoun thing, for example, and how it can be used in the classroom. I know a lot of people here at Iowa State has been working on this. Emily has worked on this before. Other people that gave the plenary here last year also have been like working on this. I think it's a matter of like creating tasks, perhaps integrating AI so the burden is not on the teachers. Just some examples of what I think could be done in the classroom. Remember, I started as a teacher, so I have to give some teaching ideas. I think in this study, what we see is a lot of this assignment, like the lack of variation. So it would help to give a whole class to generate the same essay on the same topic and compare the results, because they would see like this repetition. Students can try to identify AI versus student writing. In fact, one of the teachers that participated in this study now uses the same excerpts with her students to show like the difference between AI and the student writing. Students can try to revise the AI-generated assignments to make it more personal, perhaps, to add these features of involvement. Basically, we need to show how AI performs across different assignments to students so that they are aware to what extent they can use the AI and what they need to put in. I don't think we'll be able to ever like block students completely of using, so I'm just thinking of like strategies that we could do in the classroom. There's a lot of future studies that need to be done, like to what extent can AI generate assignments replicating disciplinary differences? What are the moves of AI-generated essays? I know we saw Elena Kotos and Burak presenting earlier in the first session here, but we also need this repetition, right, of AI also is reflected on the moves of the essays that the AI produced, and that would be interesting to look at. We need to look at students' perspectives, like how are students using generative AI for their assignments? Again, like Svetlana Koltovskaya and other people have recently published on this, like students using, they video recorded students using generative AI for revision, the ethical use of GenAI to revise the written assignments, like is this an opportunity for students who wouldn't be able to afford tutors or not? And going back to, I was desperate, you all remember that, right? The use of generative AI in written assignments. I was like, okay, oh my God, there's no more writing. But I think that rather than living in fear that generative AI will be used to like write all assignments, researchers and people doing writing should be focusing on different things, like describing the language of generative AI. I was against it, and you can see now I'm doing it, because I think that we need to describe the language of generative AI, even though the goalpost is always changing. But if we don't describe, we won't know how to develop like better generative AI for educational purposes. Like, what is the AI getting right and what is it getting wrong? Understanding the extent it can be useful for students and for teachers, and developing this like AI literacy training for language teachers that are short, and giving like practical applications and sharing lesson plans and teaching materials using AI. I know I mentioned a lot of references, so rather than present all of them, I put them all here on this link so you can get it. Thank you. You didn't tell me to stop. Or maybe you didn't know.
Any questions from the room? Okay. Babs. So thank you so much for the very nice presentations on cognitive purposes, and I really want to learn more about that. I am interested to ask questions about the MBA results on dimension 1. So you mentioned that the students' rating has variance, a lot more variance than the text produced by ChatGPT, and I think Dr. Oakes put us in low variance if we talk about the statistical analysis. My question is, is the result on the students writing that is more involved, is something that you expect to see? And you mentioned that, well, there is involvement in the prompt, so we probably want to see the linguistic features that tell us about the involved here for the dimension one. But is that something that we expect to see for the essay they produce and for the registers that they produce in relation to maybe the stage of their writing at this point and the academic at that academic level?
That's a good question, because when I say that like there was this expectation of involvement, it's not clearly stated in the prompt, like you have to write an involved essay. And you saw one of the prompts, right? Let's say the prompt is talk about media stereotype. When the student perform, so this is the difference between prompt and how the students realize that prompt. When the students are putting that into concrete terms, they ended up like perhaps bringing examples from their personal lives, and that's not in the prompt. So that's what we see involvement. Now, when we write a critique, perhaps, or like, let's look at the personal narrative, right? The personal narrative, again, it doesn't ask you to specifically write an involved answer. That's not what is there. But you say, tell me about your grandmother. So it is implicit that you're going to have to use first person pronouns here. So that's why we see ChatGPT being better when we say, write about your grandmother, specifically like your personal experience. And the same thing doesn't happen with essays. I think if the assignment, what I learned is, and I didn't expect that, is even when the assignment doesn't request personal experience, the students will include that. And ChatGPT won't, because it doesn't know what to do.
We have a question from Zoom from Sadia. Explain, how did you gather data from students and generative AI?
Oh, okay. That's very, so this is part of, I think I mentioned, this is part of a larger corpus of undergraduate writing in linguistics. We just selected the text that had that we had access to what the teachers asked the students to write. And then we gave the same prompt that the teachers gave the students to the generative AI. Yeah, this is part of like a much larger project looking at complexity features. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, so when you were saying teachers could or couldn't identify whether it was written by the student or GenAI, was that their own students that they knew, or
No.
was that? So I guess I wanted
Yeah.
to point out that probably if you know the students and have seen them write, teachers are going to identify way higher than what this says. So we see in the general education world or in the public domain, people saying, well, teachers can't identify this because they're using that kind of data. When in fact, if you know your students, you probably would be way, way higher in terms of identification.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So if you couldn't hear this, I bet you could. That like teachers are better identifying their own students. We didn't use the teachers in this case because these assignments were set by multiple different teachers, right? We couldn't like wrangle all of them. We also wanted to know like overall, like how writing instructors would do in identifying. And I think that this actually, these results support your points that even when it's not their students, they're still very good at identifying at this point, because I think that the more ChatGPT generative AI has been out, the better teachers are at identifying if it is generative AI or not. So we collected this data probably like May this year. And ChatGPT has been like out for some time already, right? So even these writing instructors were very good at identifying. Yeah, there's some that are off, but most of them were correct.
Oh, lots of questions. We have a question from Zoom first, from Madeline. Grammarly has recently announced a new tool called authorship that is able to identify the source of information in writing, including whether the information was pasted from an AI generator. Do you believe teachers should use their intuition to guess whether the text was original or AI generated? Or should they use these kinds of tools, which don't require teachers to make a guess and potentially firstly accuse students of using AI when they didn't?
That's again a great question, because there's a lot of research now on like how well does generative AI do at recognizing generative AI. And so far there isn't a perfect one. So I would never trust any like 100%. I think it's a combination of like perhaps your intuition or like your knowledge as a teacher, like what you're saying. You probably know your student writing better than anybody else. and perhaps like using an identifier like this. But I think it's impossible at this point to make claims like, oh, you definitely use generative AI for this assignment. I think the solution, if you don't want students to use generative AI, is to set like creative assignments. Perhaps the students have to analyze some type of data because it's going to be harder to use generative AI in that case. Question from Larissa?
The two of us have
Hey,
that
mine's-
too, Robert.
Okay, two, yeah,
Sorry if I
combined
missed this
question.
Earlier, but were the student papers meant to be successful examples or to show a broad range of?
No, they're all like very successful students. Like they're like very, how can I say, like they all got like A+ in their assignments. Yeah, they're like, I don't have C's here.
Oh, thank you so much for this much needed research. Linguistic evaluation of AI is really, really needed. Desperately needed. It's amazing. I resonate a lot. First, I have a comment. I like it that you said we need to work with AI. So do you see a possibility for students to learn from the AI, some aspect of AI writing? Like I like my graduate students to write more academically, more information, you know. So what's the right? Yeah.
So I think the argument pro using AI, it's exactly like for students like us who like English is a second language, the ability to have like a reviser, you know, like somebody who can review your paper, a tutor, right like there. So I think you could, it really depends on what are your needs, but I think you can use for academic writing, ChatGPT, AI, etc. It's just a matter of like balancing out what your level is, because if you don't know how to write academic papers yet, then you don't want students to be using at that point. So, you know, I think it's like making the argument to students that if you want to learn, you need to practice.
The second question is, sorry, can you go back, please go back to the prompt page.
It's gonna take some time.
Yeah, it's gonna take a long time.
This is probably like slide 2.
Because I also agree with you that AI can only do what you tell. AI has been proven to be so sensitive to prompting.
Yeah.
It's only as good as the prompt. So if we find that AI does not give you in-text citations and reference list, if you add it in your prompt, would that change the outcome?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. So we didn't want to, did I pass for the prompt already?
Okay, yeah,
Right.
yeah, right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, if we had asked, so we just said you were a competent university student in linguistics, writing an essay responding to the prompt, because we knew it was an essay. We didn't say like, don't include bullet points, don't include lists. So we gave, because I'm a register person, right? I want to know if ChatGPT is like sensitive to this register variation. So if I tell ChatGPT, this is an essay, does it have like the construct of what an essay is that usually would include some type of references and so on? So yeah, if you want to make it like more accurate, if you're a student trying to cheat, you could totally do that. Like add more references. This is not good enough. Add a reference list and so on. You could do that, but we want it to be like give like almost nothing.
I understand it now when I do some similar. Oh, I ended up doing two kinds of prompts, the direct prompts, and then the other one that's more elaborate, the academic prompt, and the results are very different.
Yeah, I imagine it would be like different too. It's a good research question, you know, to like replicate this, but giving more, like it's not close enough to what the students did. So yeah, in that.
Thank you for the great presentation. We'll now have to have our lunch break.
So the lunch is here in room 215, and then coffee, chai latte, other chais in the kitchen, boiled water, brewed coffee, gourmet, tea coffee.
I'm gonna grab lunch. A única coisa que você faz é errado. Não, mas você. Good work. Thank you.